Hi, welcome or welcome back. My name is Eleanor. Before I start to describe the flowchart that I needed to write myself in my notes to keep track of all the tangents I went on in my reading, I wanted to mention that the comments section in my last video is, I believe, especially interesting. I had several comments about different poems, and especially a discussion I had with Poetry Crone about a couple of particular poems by A.E. Stallings. And one of them is called The Rosehead Nail, which is, I think, especially applicable to also what I'm talking about this week. And so this week, I'm going to put a link to a very short video I found a couple of days ago showing a blacksmith making a rosehead nail. And that's, I just found that fascinating, both in and of itself, but also because A.E. Stallings chose to write this poem about what it's like to watch that process. And that process reminds me of one of the threads in my reading this week, which is the process of a craftsperson / artist making one object very deliberately, very carefully, and for want of a better word, professionally. They have experience, and ultimately the poems that I read this week had that characteristic. They feel like carefully made, beautiful objects that can have both practical and aesthetic uses and are fascinating, in and of themselves. So, to start with, the beginning of the flowchart that I made for myself. I will have to look down at my notes because it's very hard to keep track. I decided to listen for the second time to a podcast episode that had intrigued me several weeks ago. The podcast is called Poetry Off the Shelf. It's the Poetry Foundation's podcast. The episode is from January 8th, 2025, so very recent, and it's titled Poets We Lost in 2024. It refers to two poetry critics, Helen Vendler and Marjorie Perloff. They both were working at around the same time, very different women, different interests, similar in their passion for poetry. And, unfortunately, they both passed away a week after the other in March of 2024, if I'm not mistaken. I will link to that episode, and I highly recommend it because it's beautifully done. It contains interviews with their students, and I think in Marjorie Perloff's case, her children as well. And it really gives a beautiful, well-rounded idea of how they came into the literary world, how they made the decision to be critics rather than poets, what it meant to them. Now, I am sure that I'm going to talk about Marjorie Perloff in a separate video, but for this one, I started doing a deep dive this week into the world of Helen Vendler. I had heard her mentioned, seen her name crop up, but didn't have the impetus to look into her until this podcast episode. So what I did was I, first of all, went to another podcast episode, of course. This one is also part of the Poetry Foundation, but it's the podcast that's titled Poetry Lectures. It's separate from Poetry Off the Shelf. Again, link below. And this was from October 14th, 2008. Helen Vendler American perspectives. And what she had, I believe she'd been asked to talk about the artist Jasper Johns. And she had chosen to compare Jasper Johns' gray paintings, gray works, to the poems of Wallace Stevens. Among the many poets she loved, she was a Wallace Stevens scholar, from what I can tell. And what that did to me, not only did it sort of reintroduce Jasper Johns to me, that I've known, a little bit about, but it also brought me to Wallace Stevens. Wallace Stevens is an American poet, known to be difficult. I've had his collected poems for a long time on my shelf. It's such a great kind of vintage looking. I love the cover on it. But in any case, if you've been playing it along, I sort of gravitate towards poems that are, how would you describe them? Mostly written by women, I suppose. Mostly more contemporary, mostly like very mysterious. And Wallace Stevens, his poems I always felt were quite intellectual. They were sort of like intellectual puzzles in a way. If I'm not going to be honest here, where am I going to be honest? I've had this for years, haven't opened it. But Helen Vendler, see, this is why you need the scholars, you need them, because the way she spoke about him, the way she spoke about specific poems of his, the way she brought them into the idea of the still life, the way she brought them into a comparison and an assessment with Jasper Johns' work was so utterly intriguing. And I think I'm always looking, as I've said before, for a door or a window through an unusual passageway into someone major. And that did it for me. Now, the poems, she talks about several poems. Let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I think she talks about 5 poems, if I'm not mistaken, in the episode. I have found all but one of those poems online for free. So let's say you don't have this book as I did, because I immediately had to go in here and find the poems she was talking about. I will leave the links to each of those poems. So although there's one poem which is not, the poem The Green Plant by Wallace Stevens is, as far as I can tell, not available online. But the others are. Go to my links, because it's very helpful to go online, look at each poem as she's talking about it. What happened next? What happened next, Eleanor? A lot happened this week. Okay, what happened next was I went and downloaded one of her books. I thought I must read one of her critical works. And the one that seemed most enticing to me is called The Ocean, the Bird, and the Scholar, Essays on Poets and Poetry. I should say I often go and have a browse around Instagram for different contemporary poets who often refer to what's happening in the poetry world. And I did find someone, I don't remember who commented on a page that said last year, oh, it's so sad that Helen Vendler has passed away. They commented, I will always treasure her for giving me the book, The Ocean, the Bird, and the Scholar. And I thought, okay, if that has been singled out by, a contemporary poet as something that they adore, I too will read it. And it is a marvelous book. And I should say, okay, before I talk about the book proper, let me try not to go on too many tangents in this video. The introduction is superb. If for nothing else you pick up this book, do read the introduction. She explains the title, The Ocean, the Bird, and the Scholar, and she gets the idea for the title from 1943 Wallace Stevens poem called Somnambulisme. It is one of the poems I link to, and she talks about in the podcast episode. Why does she do that? Because in this poem, he's got an image of the ocean as constantly evolving and changing. He's got an image of a bird that is flying over the ocean, diving in and out, but the bird is mortal. It dies and other birds take over its role. And then the third image, the third role within this poem is the scholar. Yes, the scholar. And while there are many ways of, reading Wallace Stevens' poems, to her, she saw this as the ocean, the ever-present ocean of language, coming in, going out, the birds being the poets who are using that language, the artists, the craftspeople. But those two are nothing without the scholar who brings it all together and also helps it move from generation to generation, so that historically, we think about the poets of the past, the present, and we look forward to the future. And it is the scholar who is doing that. And that is something that I have thought about. Ever since I started reading poetry seriously and really adoring it and wanting to go deeper into it and talking about it on BookTube here, I've realized that in BookTube, let's talk about that specifically. We're teetering. There's a seesaw. On one side, it's the reader who knows nothing at all about the Academy and just enjoys whatever they enjoy. And then on the other side is the scholar, the intellectual, who has been brought up in the Academy and has been schooled to know, to believe that it's not enough just to like or dislike, that there are deeper things at play, that there's more involved, that you need to challenge yourself intellectually, challenge the text that you're reading, be rigorous, look to history, look to comparisons. Don't be complacent in your reading. What you might not enjoy today might be mind-altering and world-altering should you look at it further. And the two communities, the communities of one and the other, I see them on two different poles. And if you, for myself at least, I can only speak to myself and my own experience on BookTube. I feel that I am that crazy person who is standing in the middle of the seesaw, and as it's teetering back and forth, I too am teetering back and forth. And both the scholar and the reader are cheering me on. This week was a week where I felt empowered with the joy that came from reading Helen Vendler's work. Now, each chapter in this particular book is dedicated to a different poet. And yes, she is a scholar. She writes in a scholarly manner. She does bring in personal, opinion, but each essay is rigorous. And so, you have to take it with a grain of salt. It's not for everyone, but for me, it was exactly what I needed. And I'm very grateful to have discovered her, even though unfortunately it's after her passing. So I see that I made a note for myself that I might want to read you a quote This is from the introduction, Helen Vendler. The arts and the studies of the arts are for Stevens a symbiotic pair, each dependent on the other. Nobody is born understanding string quartets or reading Latin or creating poems. Without the scholar and his libraries, there would be no perpetuation and transmission of culture. The mutual support of art and learning, the mutual delight each ideally takes in each, can be taken as a paradigm of how the humanities might be integrally conceived and educationally conveyed as inextricably linked to the arts. Fascinating, just what I needed to hear to keep me going. There's a large community out there, and you can pick and choose where you would like to learn more about poetry if you do love it. Now, while all this was happening, I also came across a book. I belong to a real life book club where I have great fun. We meet once a month, but I think it's safe to say that my friends in this book club usually strongly dislike the books I like and have absolutely no interest in poetry. It's very refreshing to me and enjoyable. However, it can be somewhat frustrating. So when this book came across our book club table, I was very excited because it looked like something that I actually, might really be into. And it's called All the Beauty in the World by Patrick Bringley. It is nonfiction. It's a museum guide's adventures in life, loss, and art. Patrick Bringley decided to quit his job at the New Yorker. This was in 2008, following a family tragedy. His older brother sadly passed away, and so he took up a role as a guard at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in Manhattan. And he ended up working there for 10 years. Yes, 10 years. In that amount of time, he had 2 children born. Many things happened. He's a brilliant writer. He actually ends up knowing a lot about art, although I don't think his background was initially in art. I think it was more in literature and writing. And I highly recommend this book. Now, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, I looked it up, was formed originally in 1880. At the moment, it has 600 guards. Now, when I say guards, I'm talking about the men and women that you see in suits standing in each gallery, making sure that we don't, touch anything, break anything, get into any trouble. And I've never really thought about the guards and never paid much attention to it. But Patrick Bringley brings the life of the guard to new life in his descriptions. He's able to, first of all, describe the traditional behind-the-scenes goings-on of the Metropolitan, which in and of itself is so enjoyable. For example, they have a tailor who works there full time, an elderly gentleman. And so when they have a tear in a pocket of a blazer, they can go and get that fixed. Little things like that. Also the back and forth between the guards, becoming friendly with them, the way they're organized, the way they're given their shifts, the different backgrounds the guards come from is illuminating. But really the most fascinating is how Bringley is able to describe his thoughts on the art as he sees it. Sometimes he might be standing in the same room, in the one room, for many days. Sometimes he's, as they say, pushed from one room to the other. And he's also people watching all the time, and he has interactions. I've never interacted with the guard, but apparently a lot of people interact with the guards, and a lot of people go through the museum. Now, a couple of additional bonuses in this book is that you do have illustrations, and there are sketches. They seem like half-done sketches of the works that he's talking about. It's absolutely brilliant. I mean, I really, hats off to whoever put this book together. Now, the artist I will leave a link to. I wrote down her name. Where is it? Maya McMahon, a young artist who did the sketches. Fabulous. Also, at the end, there's a list of each and every work of art that he's discussed. I would really recommend that if you are planning a trip to the Met, or if you've been to the Met before, you will definitely want to go to the Met after reading this. And there is no doubt in my mind that if I do find myself in Manhattan, which I hope I do soon at some point again, my visit to the Met will be completely different. Now, this book was doubly interesting for me because you may know this is like one of my favorite poetry books now, Information Desk by Robyn Schiff, that very recently came out, I think last year. Now, here's a good idea. If you know someone who is a literary person, I should say, because they're really a deep thinker perhaps, who is going for a visit to Manhattan, giving them these two books, what an amazing gift. What an amazing gift. Now, Information Desk I've talked about in a couple of videos already. I encourage you to go look them up if you're thinking of reading it. It is, I will say, it is not an easy read at first, but it is captivating once you get into Robyn Schiff's world. And the comparison, I mean, written around the same time, one is a prose memoir, one is a poetry. She calls it a book-length poem. She calls it an epic. A woman versus a man, the male versus the female view. The information desk versus the guard. I looked up, Robyn Schiff was, unfortunately, I thought maybe they were working in the same years maybe, but no, she started working at the information desk there in 1995 and for about 5 years on and off, and he only started 2008, so he came after her. He doesn't mention any female guard. No, there is a female guard at the very beginning, but mostly they're male. Now, Robyn Schiff has several anecdotes about situations that made her uncomfortable being a woman working there. And one of the situations she discusses in her poem is a guard who kind of follows her around. It kind of freaks her out and doesn't leave her alone. So in a way that's interesting, but also at the very end of her book, of the book-length poem, she does mention the guards and the way that they sweep through the museum, which is something that Patrick Bringley, was doing too. And she talks about the high kicks in perfect formation that she imagines the guards doing as they move in a line. So there are also some overlaps in their discussions of the works of art, so fascinating to read them in tandem. So I was reading, one more thing about I'm checking my notes. One more thing about these two books. This is a book about healing and the strength of silently standing in a room of good art, mostly from ancient times or, from previous centuries in any case, and healing and grieving. This is very much a feel-good memoir. This is not. This is abrasive in many ways. It's a celebration. This is a celebration of art, a celebration of the Met, but also a I wrote in my notes, a haunted house of a book. It discusses I don't want to say the uglier side of art. That's not actually true. It discusses the way art has changed through the centuries and the way artists have dealt with social structures, and also the idea that artists are, they're human, and they might steal from each other, they might use each other's work, and what is an authentic piece of art? What is an artwork that might speak to you for unusual reasons? For example, something that I didn't mention, I made a point of not mentioning it in my video on Information Desk because I kind of thought it might be a spoiler. But if you haven't read the Information Desk yet, I doubt it'll be a spoiler. It might interest you actually and entice you to read the book. And it is a reference that she makes to porcelain and to white porcelain. And let me find it. Robyn Schiff's Information Desk, pages 98 and 99. On page 98, I quote, and the quote begins actually with someone else's quote. No people live longer than the documents of their culture. Know who said that? Contemplate it a few cool beats while I look out my window and watch a squirrel nibble an acorn. Maybe fold some laundry and talk to my son if he answers his phone in the back seat of the car. And on the following page, exactly opposite, but continuing the poem, all of a sudden, out of nowhere, she says, it was Hitler who said it, referring to a porcelain figurine of a fencer leaning on his weapon, shirt off, porcelain flesh, the white of his porcelain pants, part of the uniform called in toto his whites. White porcelain is the embodiment of the German soul, he continued. Took Poland and also the Meissen porcelain factory, the expressive tool of the Reich with satellite operation in Dachau by Dachau labor. Yes, Robyn Schiff doesn't let you heal. She doesn't really let you heal in the way Patrick Bringley does. Depending on your mood, you might choose one book or the other. Both books are spectacularly written. Now, in thinking about that quote about the white porcelain in Robyn Schiff's book, I have to tell you about a poem that I came across this week that has everything to do with ceramics in a way, and it brought me back to this quote. I was already thinking about Robyn Schiff because of the Patrick Bringley book, but it also brought me to another path and to read one more book this week. And I should say that the Patrick Bringley book is very easy reading and it's a very quick book to read. And this next book is quite short, so no need to think that I've been reading away the week. It's really not that much. So I'm a subscriber to Sean Singer. Sean Singer is a poet and poetry teacher. He has a Substack and you can subscribe to him. Now, part of the free subscription, I pay for a subscription as well, but part of the free subscription allows you to, Monday through Friday, see his selection of his daily selection, 5 poems every day on a particular topic. One of these days last week, I came across his poems on the topic pillow. And one of the poems, I'll actually put it up here because it's very short. I often go to very short poems, and I'll leave a link to his Substack, but you can also find this poem on the Poetry Foundation website. Okay, so this is the poem Pillow by Jana Prikryl, a contemporary poet who I think is also, let me just look this up. I think she's also the editor. She's also senior editor at the New York Review of Books. Okay, here's the poem. How solitary and resolute you look in the morning, a stoic in your cotton sleeve. Do you dream of walking out, rain or shine, a truffle balanced on your sternum and passing me on the sidewalk? Or is that a smile because you interpret nothing and statelessness is where you live? How calmly you indulge my moods. See you tonight by the Sovereign Chartreuse ceramics at the Met. Let's hear what you do differently. I find this poem really amusing. I can't tell you how many times I've thought about it this week, and I have forwarded it to friends and they all have the same reaction. Yeah, I love it. How can you not love it? I mean, it's amusing, but it also has depth, it has subtext, you can read it in many different ways. And serendipity, it mentioned the Met. So I started looking up ceramics in the Met, porcelain, and then I started putting in the word porcelain. And what do I come across? The name Edmund de Waal. He is a potter, a very famous potter, very famous writer. Now, many years ago, he came out with the huge bestseller of a book, The Hare with the Amber Eyes. So I went to the library and I found that his most recent book was Letters to Camondo. I took this out of the library. Letters to Camondo. Very short book with photos in it of artworks. And also his book, both of these are nonfiction. Also, The White Road, a pilgrimage of sorts, where he talks about going, I mean, this is quite a big book, which I haven't, I've only flipped through, where he talks about who first made porcelain, the history of porcelain, and his experience of working with porcelain. I was very, very attracted to reading Letters to Camondo, and I highly recommend it. It came out in 2021. It is a book based on facts, absolute facts, but written as a series of letters that he, as himself, Edmund de Waal, is writing to a man called Moïse Camondo, who died before World War II. Monsieur Camondo was a wealthy Jewish art lover who moved from Constantinople to Paris in the late 19th century, and had a magnificent house built for him and his family in Paris, and collected artworks of many sorts, including large pieces of furniture. And it was like he and his family were living in a museum. He was also extremely generous in donating those artworks to different French museums and sharing his love. His dream was that his son, Nissim, he had a son, Nissim, and a daughter, Beatrice, that Nissim would inherit this. Unfortunately, Nissim died in an airplane as a soldier during World War I. And this broke Monsieur Camondo's heart. Now, he eventually decided to leave his entire house with all of its belongings to France. And it is now a public museum. I looked it up. It's incredible. If you ever go to Paris, I mean, it would be the first place I would go to. What an incredible collection, what an incredible house, what an incredible museum. This book, so Edmund de Waal is going through archives, and Monsieur Camondo apparently kept almost every piece of paper he had. The archives are immense. And so Edmund de Waal was, going through them, and so he mentions them in his letters to Monsieur Camondo. And it's such a clever, such a brilliant way of presenting this story. And as the story progresses and we share, and there's beautiful color photographs in this book, as we share in the glory of the works and in the glory of the neighborhood as well. It was a wealthy Jewish neighborhood. There were, families that thought of each other as cousins, really, in a way. And through marriage, many of them were connected. And it harkens back to this brief golden era in Paris, where the Jewish citizens felt that, yes, they could think of themselves as truly French, that they could be accepted and included until World War II, when everything came crashing down. And as I was reading the book, I didn't know much about the books. I just started it basically blind. And as you reach the last quarter of the book, you get a terrible feeling and remember, oh, yes, World War II. Oh, yes. It's a heartbreaking book. I found it, I will warn you that it's not explicit at all. In fact, if anything, it's subtle at the end, in the sense that it's just a few sentences about the murder of almost all of the citizens of that neighborhood, as well as the deportation of the Jews of France. Monsieur Camondo did not live long enough, thank God, in a way, to see, what happened to his darling daughter Beatrice and her children. Moving on, I listened to the first 8 minutes of a podcast that had an episode that was interviewing Edmund de Waal, and I was especially interested in it because the first thing that the interviewer decides to ask him about is the poetry of Paul Celan, of all things. It turns out that Edmund de Waal is a great poetry lover, and Paul Celan is his favorite poet, I believe. And I will leave a link to the start of that episode, and they discuss a poem called Etched Away. So I thought I would read from that. I should say, by serendipity, I recently watched the latest video that Biblio Sophie came out with. Hi, Sophie. I'm a big fan of Biblio Sophie, and she, through chance, has just read a few Paul Celan poems, and I would recommend that as well. So this one is called Etched Away. Well, that's how it starts anyway. Etched away from the ray-shot wind of your language, the garish talk of rubbed-off experience, the 100-tongued pseudo-poem, the gnome, world clear, free your way through the human-shaped snow, the penitent snow, to the hospitable glacier rooms and tables. Deep in time's crevasse, by the alveolate ice, waits a crystal of breath, your irreversible witness. And that was the last thing I read this week, and so I'll end there. Thank you for being in this space. Thank you for listening. Please go and comment if you would like. I always read my comments. I don't always immediately have time to read the comments, but eventually I always get to them. All the best to you, and don't forget, the only real property is the property of the mind. Bye.